The silk blindfold pressed against Elara Blackthorn's eyes, but it did nothing to dampen the overwhelming noise of the royal feast. Abandoned by her pack's elder near the entrance, she counted her steps, 50 paces to the back wall. Or so she thought. A waiter bumped her, spinning her around, and in her panic, she moved toward the nearest source of warmth. Her hand found the back of a high velvet chair, and she sank into it, grateful to be off her trembling legs. Instantly, the roar of the feast died. The silence was absolute. Elara froze. To her right, she felt an aura of immense power, hot and crackling like a storm. She smelled expensive spices, steel, and pure alpha dominance. Her hand, resting on the tablecloth, was suddenly engulfed by a much larger, warmer one. "Do you know where you sit, girl?" a voice asked, low and dangerous, vibrating through the table. I am lost," Elara whispered, terrified, sensing the cold metal of a sword resting mere inches from her arm. "You are at the high table," the voice replied, the grip on her hand tightening possessively. "Beside the king." Elara gasped, trying to pull her hand away to flee, but the fingers held firm, not to hurt, but to anchor. "Stay," King Raiden commanded, his intense gaze challenging the silent room. "The view is better from here." The collective intake of breath from the hundreds of nobles gathered in the great hall sounded like a sudden, sharp wind, chilling Elara to the bone. She could feel the weight of their stares, a physical pressure prickling against her skin, judging the blind Omega who dared to occupy the seat of a high-ranking diplomat. Or worse, a queen. "Your Majesty," a tremor-filled voice squeaked from the other side of the table. The scent of stale sweat and terror wafted toward Elara. A servant, likely terrified that the king's wrath would spill onto him for this failure. "Forgive the intrusion. There has been a mistake. The girl, she is confused. I will remove her at once." Elara flinched, her muscles coiling to bolt. I apologize, I didn't mean. Did I ask you to remove her?" Raiden's voice was a low rumble, felt more than heard, vibrating through the heavy oak table and into Elara's fingertips. The servant sputtered, the sound dying in his throat. "But, sire, the protocols. She is unmated. Blind. A tribute from the outer packs. I have eyes, servant. I can see what she is." Raiden's thumb brushed the back of Elara's hand, a slow, deliberate circle that sent a jolt of confusing warmth up her arm. It was a grounding touch, shocking in its gentleness compared to the steel in his tone. "What she is seated." He released her hand only long enough to gesture sharply at the empty table setting before her. "Bring a plate. And wine. The finest vintage." For the girl," the servant whispered, disbelief coloring his tone. Raiden shifted, the rustle of his heavy velvet robe sounding like the unfurling of dragon wings. "For my guest." The silence that followed was deafening. The servant scrambled away, his footsteps frantic against the stone floor, desperate to obey. Elara sat frozen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt small, fragile in her soft blue gown, a doe caught in a den of lions. "You should let me go," she whispered, leaning slightly toward him, her voice barely audible over the rising murmur of the crowd. "They are staring. I am shaming you." "Let them stare," Raiden replied, his voice dropping to an intimate register meant only for her. "They have spent years looking at me with fear. It will do them good to look with confusion for a night." He reached out, his large hand covering hers once more, effectively pinning her to the world of the elite. There was no escape now. He had drawn a line in the sand with a single command, and by keeping her there, he had placed her under the most dangerous shelter in the kingdom, his own shadow. A heavy porcelain plate was placed before her, the sound sharp against the polished wood. The aroma of rosemary, rich gravy, and roasted game wafted up, making Elara's empty stomach clench, though fear had long since stolen her appetite. She hesitated, her hands hovering uncertainly over the table. In the darkness of her blindfold, a simple meal was a landscape of potential hazards, a spilled goblet, a dropped fork, a stain that would mark her as clumsy and unfit for such company. She felt the shift in the air before he moved. Raiden leaned closer, his presence collapsing the distance between them. The heavy, gold-embroidered velvet of his sleeve brushed against the delicate, pale blue silk of her gown. It was a collision of worlds. The aggressive, regal red of the Alpha King bleeding into the soft, yielding sky blue of the Omega. To the watching court, it must have looked like a conqueror claiming a prize, but to Elara, it felt like a shield being raised. "Allow me," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. He didn't wait for permission. His large hand, warm and rough with callus from the sword hilt, slid beneath her wrist. He lifted her hand with a reverence that belied his terrifying reputation, guiding her fingers to the heavy silver fork. "The pheasant is sliced at 6 o'clock, he instructed quietly, moving her hand gently so she could feel the weight of the meat through the utensil. "Root vegetables at 9. And a wine sauce, rich but not overpowering, drizzled over the center." Elara let him guide her movements, her breath hitching in her throat. This was an intimacy usually reserved for packmates, for family, for lovers. An Alpha King did not cut meat for a stray Omega. He did not guide her hand as if she were precious china rather than broken pottery. "Why?" she breathed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. "Why do you do this?" Raiden paused, his hand still covering hers, encompassing it completely. The noise of the great hall, the clattering of cutlery, the whispers of the highborn, the rustle of stiff fabrics, seemed to fade into a distant hum. Inside the bubble of heat he created, there was only the scent of storm and spice, and the steady, reassuring weight of his grip. "Because," Raiden replied, guiding her fork to pierce a tender piece of pheasant, "hunger is the one enemy I do not permit in my hall." "Eat, Elara." As she took the first bite, guided by the most powerful man in the kingdom, the terrifying vastness of the dark room shrank down to the warm, steady point of contact between his hand and hers. "Is it comfortable?" The question was sudden, cutting through the quiet rhythm of their meal. Raiden's voice was closer now, as if he had leaned in to inspect the strip of silk bound across her face. Elara paused, her fork hovering halfway to her lips. She lowered it slowly. "I am used to it, Your Majesty." "That is not what I asked." She felt the heat of his gaze on the fabric, searing and intense. "It puts others at ease," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "My eyes, they are not like yours. They are clouded. Empty. People find them unsettling. It is better to hide the defect than to offend the court." A sharp, derisive sound escaped Raiden's throat, a scoff that sounded like grinding stones. "You bind yourself so that cowards do not have to face a reality they cannot understand. They are the ones who are defective, Elara. Not you." His words were harsh, but they lacked the cruelty she had come to expect from alphas. Instead, there was a rigid, unyielding honesty in them. He poured more wine into her goblet, the liquid splashing softly, a sound of normalcy amidst the tension. "The world is full of things that are difficult to look at," Raiden muttered, almost to himself. "Hiding them does not make them disappear." Elara turned her head slightly, angling her ear toward him. Without the distraction of sight, the energy radiating from him was palpable, a physical force pressing against her senses. Most alphas projected dominance, lust, or aggression. But beneath the layers of storm and steel that made up the king's aura, she felt something else. Something heavy. It felt like iron dragged over stone. "You are tired," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The movement of his goblet stopped. "I am a king during negotiation season. Of course I am tired." "No," Elara corrected gently, her Omega instincts overriding her fear. She reached out, her fingers brushing the velvet of his sleeve, finding the tension coiled in the muscle beneath. "Not your body. Your spirit. It is heavy. Like you have been holding up the ceiling of this hall by yourself for a very long time." The silence that stretched between them was different this time. It wasn't the terrified silence of the court, but the stunned silence of a man who had forgotten what it was like to be perceived. "Be careful," little Omega, Raiden warned, though his voice had lost its dangerous edge, replaced by a weary fascination. You see too much for a woman wearing a blindfold. Perhaps, she whispered, withdrawing her hand, though the echo of his exhaustion lingered on her fingertips. Or perhaps everyone else is simply looking at the crown, and forgetting to look at the man beneath it. The warmth of the wine and Raiden's unexpected candor had almost lulled Elara into a false sense of safety. Then, it struck. A sensation like a serrated blade scraped against her awareness, tearing through the protective bubble the king had created. Elara gasped, her hand jerking spasmodically, knocking her silver fork against the rim of her plate with a sharp clatter that rang out like a warning bell. Raiden went rigid beside her. The weariness she had sensed moments ago vanished, replaced instantly by the lethal, coiled tension of a predator. His hand abandoned his goblet and moved instinctively toward the hilt of the sword resting against his chair. "What is it?" His voice was a hushed command, his head angling to scan the room, though he kept his body oriented toward her to shield her from view. "Someone," Elara whispered, her breath trembling. She fought the urge to cover her chest, feeling the emotion as a physical pressure against her sternum. Someone is watching. Not with curiosity. With hate. She turned her blindfolded face toward the far end of the high table, past the heavy scents of roasted meats and perfumes, locking onto the source of the icy disturbance. It was a specific, concentrated beam of malice. "It feels like broken glass," she murmured, struggling to articulate the sensation. "Jagged. Bitter. He wants what you have. He hates that you have it. The jealousy, it tastes like rot." Raiden followed the line of her sight. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking rhythmically as he stared down the length of the table. His scent flared, ozone and burnt wood, a warning signal that made the nearby nobles flinch and stare into their plates. "Kale," Raiden murmured, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Who?" "My brother," Raiden answered, his tone flat and cold. "Prince Kale." He turned back to Elara, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of genuine admiration in his aura, bright and sharp, cutting through his usual defenses. "My royal guard scan the room for blades and poison, Elara. They watch for assassins in the rafters and spies in the kitchens. But in 10 years, none of them have ever spotted Kale's intent before he made a move." He picked up her fork, wiping it on a linen napkin with deliberate, calm movements before placing it back in her hand. The metal was warm from his touch, a small reassurance against the cold draft of the prince's envy. "You found him in 10 seconds, he said, his voice laced with a dark sort of approval. "Your eyes may be clouded, little Omega, but your instincts are sharper than any steel in this hall. Do not let him unsettle you. He is merely a shadow." Elara gripped the fork, nodding slowly, but the jagged feeling remained, a hook caught in her skin, pulling tight. She knew, perhaps better than the king, that shadows were the most dangerous places of all. That was where the monsters lived. The shadow did not remain distant. The jagged sensation Elara had felt scraping against her senses grew sharper, closer, until it materialized into the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of polished boots on stone. Conversation in the great hall withered and died as Prince Kale approached the high table. He moved with a prowling grace, his scent washing over Elara. A twisted mockery of the king's. Where Raiden smelled of storm and clean steel, Kale smelled of cloves and stagnant water, a cloying sweetness masking something spoiled. "Brother," Kale drawled, stopping just across the heavy oak table. His voice was smooth, like oil poured over a blade. "I must say, you have outdone yourself this year. The feast is exquisite." Raiden did not look up from his wine. He remained perfectly still, a statue of potential violence. "Kale. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Curiosity, mostly." The prince's attention shifted. Elara felt his gaze crawl over her skin like insects, lingering on her blindfold before dropping to her hands where they rested near the king's. "I see you've brought a new curiosity to the high table." Elara stiffened, resisting the urge to shrink back. She felt Raiden's aura darken, the storm within him brewing. She is a guest, Raiden said, his voice dropping an octave, a warning rumble that vibrated through the wood and into Elara's fingertips. Kale laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. A guest? Oh, Raiden, always so diplomatic. Come now, we are family. You can tell me. He leaned closer, his knuckles rapping lightly against the table, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried clearly to the silent nobles nearby. Is she a jester? I noticed she stumbled quite comically on her way in. Or perhaps a pet? I've heard blind creatures are remarkably docile once broken. The air around Raiden turned frigid. The heat he had been radiating was sucked away, replaced by a deadly, silent vacuum. Elara felt the muscles in his arm, which pressed against hers, turn to granite. Careful, Kale, Raiden said softly. You are speaking of a lady under my protection. Am I? Kale straightened, feigning innocence, though the jagged malice Elara sensed spiked higher. My apologies. It is just unusual to see the King of the North dining with a broken toy. I assumed she was here to perform a trick. Can she juggle? Or does she simply sit there and look tragic for our amusement? The insult hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Elara felt the shards of Kale's jealousy piercing her pride, but beneath the fear, indignation flared. She was not a toy. And she was certainly not broken. Since you are a guest, Kale purred, his voice dripping with false courtesy, let us share a toast. To clarity. He reached for a crystal decanter, the sound of wine sloshing against glass echoing in the tense silence. Elara's ears pricked up, tracking the movement. She heard the liquid pour once, twice. Then, she heard the faint, deliberate clink of a goblet being placed on the table. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't placed in front of her. It was set perilously close to the table's edge, far to her right. A trap. He waited for her to sweep her hand out in search of the drink, hoping she would knock the crystal over and stain the pristine tablecloth and her reputation with red wine. Beside her, Raiden shifted. He didn't speak, knowing that to intervene openly would be to admit she needed saving, which would only feed Kale's narrative. Instead, Raiden's index finger tapped the back of her hand. Twice. Right. Elara didn't hesitate. She didn't grope blindly or flinch. She moved with the fluid precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime mapping the dark. Her hand swept out, bypassing the empty space in front of her, and her fingers curled perfectly around the stem of the displaced goblet. She lifted it without spilling a drop. To clarity, Your Highness, she said, her voice steady and clear. Kale's smile faltered, the air around him souring with irritation. He swirled his own wine, his eyes narrowing. Impressive, he muttered. Tell me, Lady Elara, since you are so perceptive, how do you find the great hall's decor tonight? The crimson banners of House Drakenheart are particularly vibrant, are they not? It was a petty lie. A child's trick. He wanted her to agree, to compliment something she couldn't see, so he could mock her for praising a non-existent color. Elara lowered her glass. She inhaled deeply, filtering out the scents of roasted meat and perfume, seeking the smell of the room itself. She smelled the dry, dusty scent of ancient fabric, heavy and thick. She heard the way the sound dampened against the walls, wool, not silk. They are heavy, she observed softly, turning her blindfolded face toward him. Thick wool, I believe. They muffle the echoes of the room. She paused, a small, polite smile touching her lips. But crimson? No, Prince Kale. The dye smells metallic, like iron and dried blood. And from the weight of the dust they carry, I would say they have not been vibrant since your grandfather's reign. A ripple of shock went through the nearby listeners. Someone stifled a gasp. She hadn't just identified the banners, she had called out the decay of the court itself. Raiden let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl of approval. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his pride radiating off him in waves of heat. It seems, the king said, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement, that my guest can see the state of this kingdom better than you can, brother." Kale opened his mouth to retort, his sense spiking with humiliated rage, but the words died in his throat. A new sound cut through the murmurs of the court. The rhythmic, commanding tap of a heavy cane against stone. Tap! 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 The crowd parted like water. Even the air seemed to grow stiller, heavier. Raiden stood immediately, the movement abrupt and respectful. Beside him, Elara felt the shift in atmosphere. The jagged malice of the prince was suddenly dampened by a crushing, ancient weight. A scent approached, dried winter roses, old parchment, and the metallic tang of unyielding authority. "Mother," Raiden greeted, inclining his head. "Sit, Raiden," a voice commanded. It was brittle with age but hard as diamond. "And you, Kale, stop hovering like a vulture. It does not suit your complexion." Prince Kale stepped back, muttering a hasty apology, his presence retreating into the background. The Dowager Queen Seraphina stopped directly in front of Elara. Elara's breath hitched. She gripped the edge of the table, preparing for the dismissal she had expected all night. This was the matriarch of the Drakenheart line, the woman who had raised the ruthless king. Surely, she would not tolerate a blind Omega at the high table. "Lift your chin, child," the queen ordered. Elara obeyed, trembling. She felt cool, dry fingers touch her jaw, tilting her face upward. The queen's touch was not gentle, but it was not cruel. It was searching. The fingers traced the line of Elara's cheekbone, then moved higher, brushing the silk edge of the blindfold. For a long, terrifying moment, the queen said nothing. Elara could hear the older woman's breathing, slow, measured, rattling slightly in her chest. Then, the queen gasped softly. "I have not felt this hum in nearly 50 years, Seraphina murmured, her thumb tracing a pattern on Elara's temple. "The vibration, it sings against the skin." "Mother?" Raiden asked, his voice low. The Dowager Queen dropped her hand, turning to face the silent hall. She did not look at her sons. She looked at the court, her clouded eyes sharp with a different kind of vision. "You whisper," she announced, her voice projecting effortlessly to the rafters. "You sneer at the blind girl. You call her broken." She laughed, a dry, wheezing sound. "Fools. All of you." She turned back to Elara, her scent softening into something almost reverent. "They see a blindfold and think of darkness. They do not know that the moon goddess takes sight only to replace it with vision." She tapped her cane once, decisively. "This is not a defect, Kale. This is the seer's mark. She does not need eyes to see the rot in your soul, nor the gold in my sons." The queen placed her hand briefly over Elara's trembling one, pressing it into the table. "You are welcome at my table, little seer. Do not let them frighten you. They are merely blind." The heavy iron bell in the northern tower told midnight, the deep reverberation shaking the dust from the banners high above. The royal feast was officially concluded. Tradition dictated that this was the moment the Alpha King would rise, raise a goblet, and invite the unmated wolves of the kingdom to present themselves for the courtship season. A brutal 3 months of political maneuvering, flattery, and strategic alliances. Raiden pushed back his chair. The scrape of wood against stone was a harsh, final sound that silenced the few whispers remaining after the queen's departure. He stood to his full height, a towering figure in crimson and gold, casting a long shadow over the table. Elara felt the air thin around her. She remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from trembling. Without his body blocking the room, she felt exposed, a singular point of blue in a sea of predatory gazes. "My lords, ladies, and honored guests," Raiden began, his voice projecting without effort, filling every corner of the cavernous hall. "Tonight marks the beginning of the season. It is the time when wolves hunt for partners, for power, and for the future of their lines." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the rows of hopeful debutantes and ambitious fathers. Elara heard the rustle of anticipation, the scent of hope and perfume spiking in the air. However, Raiden continued, his tone dropping, becoming heavier, a king does not hunt for sport. He hunts for survival. He hunts for truth. His large hand moved from the table to the hilt of the greatsword resting at his hip. The leather creaked as his grip tightened, the sound distinct and terrifying in the quiet. To lay a hand on one's blade during a peace toast was a declaration of absolute seriousness, a vow bound in blood and steel. "I have sat on this throne for a decade," Raiden said, his voice roughening. "I have been offered gold, armies, and lands. I have been offered beauty without substance and power without heart. I have turned them all away." He turned slowly, looking down at Elara. She could not see him, but she felt the weight of his attention like a physical caress, warm and consuming. The jagged edges of Kale's jealousy and the court's judgment dissolved under the intensity of Raiden's focus. "The season is open for you," Raiden declared to the hall, "but my search is ended." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a stunned, suffocating silence. "I claim Elara Blackthorn," Raiden announced, his voice thundering with alpha command, leaving no room for argument or interpretation. "Let it be known, written in the laws of the pack. She is not a candidate. She is the chosen. Anyone who seeks to challenge this claim answers to my steel." He looked at the blindfolded woman who had stumbled into his life and seen him more clearly than anyone else. "The king has found his queen. Shall we?" Raiden's voice was no longer the thunder that shook the rafters, but the warm, steady rumble she had come to rely on. He offered his arm, not as a formality, but as an anchor. Elara placed her hand on his forearm, feeling the hard muscle beneath the velvet. The silence of the great hall was different now. It wasn't the silence of shock or fear, it was the silence of a world that had shifted on its axis. As they walked past the frozen rows of nobles, Elara heard nothing but the rustle of her own silk gown and the heavy, confident cadence of the king's boots. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to breathe. They had witnessed a rewriting of the law, and they were too stunned to react. The massive oak doors groaned open, and the stale heat of the feast was instantly replaced by the biting freshness of the night air. It smelled of frost, pine, and freedom. "Careful," Raiden murmured, his hand shifting to the small of her back to guide her down the stone steps. "The carriage awaits." She heard the stamping of hooves and the creak of a carriage chassis shifting under weight. A footman opened the door, but Raiden waved him away, choosing to help her inside himself. He lifted her easily, settling her onto the plush leather seats before climbing in beside her. The door clicked shut, sealing them into a private world of darkness and quiet. The noise of the court, the judgment of the council, and the malice of the prince were severed as if by a blade. As the carriage lurched forward, rocking gently over the cobblestones, Elara felt Raiden shift closer. His presence was overwhelming in the confined space, consuming all the air in the cabin. "Elara," he said softly. "Your Majesty." "Raiden," he corrected. There was a pause, heavy with unasked questions. Then, his fingers brushed her temple, hovering just over the knot of silk that bound her eyes. "When we arrive, when we are behind closed doors, may I remove this?" Elara's breath hitched. She had worn the blindfold for years, a shield against a world that found her unsettling. To remove it was to be fully exposed, to let him see the clouded, milky reality of her defect. But she remembered the Queen's words. Vision, not sight. She remembered the way he had cut her meat, the way he had defended her against his own blood. "They are not pretty," she whispered, a final defense crumbling. "I am not looking for pretty," Raiden replied, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "I am looking for you." Elara reached up, finding his hand in the dark and pressing it against her face. "Yes," she breathed. "You may." Raiden exhaled, a sound of relief and promise. As the carriage carried them away from the palace and into the night, Elara realized she was no longer counting steps in the dark. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly where she was going.